Day of Christmas series. So as just a quick reminder, what I did was I asked regular viewers and listeners to the channel for some topics to talk about, a little bit more advanced than last year when I did an advent calendar of economic concepts in property. I thought I'd do some deeper dive videos instead of a series of fairly short ones. These are a bit longer, but it gives us some time to get into a topic. I can see the comments, so if anyone is listening at this time, I haven't done anything to publicise this, unfortunately, but if anyone is listening who's a regular viewer to the channel, hopefully you can pop something in the comments and I might be able to respond to it. A lot of the time I just get new viewers because of however the YouTube algorithm works, and they tend to say some things to try and knock me off my stride, which is quite amusing, but I try my best to keep a stoic face because, let's face it, I am British after all. So today it's all about Section 24, incorporation in general for landlords, and we're going to go right into that topic, and also the fairly high profile taxation inquiries and the likes that have been kicked off on the back of all of the entire situation. So I'll do the backdrop first. Gideon George Osborne, the self-proclaimed learn economics on the job Chancellor of the Exchequer. Can't imagine too many more damaging things, but then we had Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, didn't we? So that taught us a real lesson on what to not wish for apart from anything else. But good old George in 2015 decided he would drop a bomb in the landlord community, and one that wasn't really much about raising tax revenue. It was about clipping the wings of small buy-to-let landlords. And my personal view is that really this was all part of a much bigger agenda. So David Cameron and George Osborne spent a lot of their time in politics fawning over large companies. And to an extent, you will understand why when you hear this stat. Half of all of the investment in the UK is done by only 50 of the very largest companies. So there's a real reason for cozying up to them if you want them to invest more money. Now, I actually think that's a bit naive, and I think that's a lack of understanding of how business works aside from anything else, because the one thing you can guarantee from the private sector is if you open genuine doors of opportunity, they'll walk through it, right? And even if it isn't massive companies doing that, what happens in most sectors is they grow, they change, they modify. Look at tech as the last big new sector to emerge. Lots and lots of fast growth. You may or may not have heard of companies like WorldCom that were the front runner to Amazon. You might remember how massive eBay was and how it sort of struggled to limber along compared to something like Amazon. The point is, you might remember MySpace, right, which was front running all the social media sites that are massive $1 trillion companies, some of them these days, right? The first mover isn't necessarily the winner, but the point is what happens in these industries is there's a big growth phase, lots of entrepreneurs, lots of startups, all the rest of it, lots of research and development. And then as things get a bit more mature, there's consolidation, there's purchasing of businesses. I remember famously Snapchat getting bought for $20 billion when it didn't have a penny of revenue. WhatsApp was similar. Why control all this stuff? Well, of course, it's about data, eyeballs, dwell time, all the rest of it, and it's actually quite scary when you get into it. Facebook, when it IPO'd, was not a great business at all, but it managed to grab a huge number of advertising dollars. It made it a lot easier than pay-per-click on Google, for example, and it made it much easier to target people. And that was the key, because it meant small businesses could get involved in advertising on Facebook. Where things have then moved on to, of course, apart from anything else, is politics has become big business on there, because as people were speculating, if Elon Musk were to give $100 million to reform, as I record this, that looks exceedingly unlikely, but these things have twists and turns in the tail, that would effectively massively influence the result of the next election in the UK, aside from anything else. And remember, there's elections all the time, right? Because there's local government elections. Local governments then are going to get more power, and Labour councillors being voted out at a rate of knots as it goes, aside from anything else. But there we go. So that's where the political backdrop came from, fawning over large companies. What did that mean? George Osborne wanted to see big companies controlling the private rental sector. And if you look to, and this is often what happens when you analyse these things on a broader level, internationally, that is the case. Much more institutional involvement in the United States in the provision of rental property, much more institutional involvement in Germany. Lots of different things go on, but those are the big two we tend to look at. Still, hopefully, thinking that we're at bat with both of them, and of course, we're not a million miles behind Germany. But a lot of developed countries that you look at, you've got a big institutional sector involved in the PRS. You look to primarily England and Wales because of devolution, apart from anything else. But you look to the UK market and you see small, fragmented, fractured landlords. Small number, average landlord still owns under 2 properties in the UK, although we're seeing significant consolidation and movement, and I think that number will go over 2 relatively quickly as smaller landlords get out and bigger, more corporate, and maybe the future institutions. And I potentially count myself as part of that, because we've operated at significant scale and have just about managed to make the business model work in real time. So the bigger you are, the easier it is, because the easier it is to find funding, the easier it is to find more units, the easier it is to get deals, etc., 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 as you can imagine, right? So George Osborne, David Cameron decided they want to push things down this route. It wasn't really a revenue-raising activity. A lot of people forget that about Section 24 because they only see the collection of the tax and get angry about it, quite frankly, and you can understand why. But don't forget that collecting tax has a cost implication as well. And I remember reading it was going to collect about £800 million, I think, over the course of the 4 years in which good old George phased it in. But it was going to cost about the same to implement. So mind-blowing perhaps to those of us, but not even doing it for tax-raising reasons. And what we've got at the moment is an administration who are also driven by a form of ideology. It's a different and easier to see ideology, but there are similar tax rises in that department. There's an argument that VAT on private school fees, for example, Labour have said it's going to raise something between £1 and £1.5 billion. Whereas most people, unfortunately, that might be the revenue raised from the VAT directly. But what's the cost to the public purse if 50,000 children go into the state system? Well, they reckon total cost is around about £10,000 a year per child. So that would be 5 billion by my no, it wouldn't be 500 million, sorry, by my estimations. But then further cost implications as well of collecting the VAT, reclaiming of VAT on other things. So private schools would change their behaviour and it won't raise any money. That's the counter argument that people are making. And we only know by seeing what happens, and very rarely are these things measured properly anyway. They're spun politically to suit. But this was the political direction that George and good old Dave wanted to go in. And George was smart, somewhat, annoyingly smart, really, George Osborne. One of the things that he did was he phased it in over 4 tax years. Why did he do this? So there wasn't a sudden exodus in the private rental market. But interestingly, if we go back, and now we can, of course, because we've got the information, over those 4 years, what also happened, which has nothing to do with this policy, is that the bond yields continued to decay in the UK. And what does this mean? Well, it just means that mortgage debt got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. We stayed at a low rate, but even landlords who were financed pre-2008, who stayed on their old mortgages, they were base rate trackers. You know, the average one was tracking about 2% above base. We had a referendum after that cut base rate. We went on a mini phase of repair up into about 2018, 2019, getting the rate up to 0.75%. Then we had the pandemic, dropping the base rate to 0.1, which stayed there, of course, until the fateful December 2021 meeting, when the hiking cycle started, and we now find ourselves in a more normalised interest rate world, probably without having seen all the effects yet play out through the economy. But what did that mean? Well, it meant George's 4-year phased policy meant that really landlords didn't particularly sell up or leave in droves or anything like that. 2015 did represent the peak of the private rental sector on all the numbers that you can find that are remotely credible, which normally is simply the number of people in the PRS as represented by the English Housing Survey, and then adding on the number of voids there are. The other way of looking at it is obviously buy-to-let mortgages and things like that, but a huge percentage of landlords, between 40 and 50, depending on whose numbers you trust, but certainly 40 seems to be a safe bet, don't have a mortgage aside from anything else. So it can be measured on things like Zoopla and Rightmove, for example, and extrapolated through things like the English Housing Survey and through knowing how often and how regularly tenancies turn over. But these figures are never exact, but they are rough. So we peaked, actually, the year after the policy was announced at nearly 5 million units in total, and that's in England, because we're talking about the English Housing Survey here. And then it's wobbled and dobbled and messed around since then. It went down, it went up a bit again during the pandemic when there was huge stimulus in the economy. Lots of people used bounce back loans to buy property. We knew that was going on left, right and centre. And of course, money went super, super cheap. So buying property was even more tempting, not necessarily in your personal name, of course. Limited company started being pushed as the way forward from the day really that George announced the policy. So what happened since Section 24? We had a number of things, a few commentators saying, well, this could happen in limited companies, so we can't guarantee that it won't happen in limited companies. That was the knee-jerk reaction back in 2015. I wasn't a big fan of this viewpoint. Obviously, 10 years down the track, it still hasn't been enacted within limited companies. Could it be? Yes, it's possible. Are they likely to do that if they want corporate landlords structured within limited companies? No. Would big institutions be structured within limited companies? Not necessarily, because they may well be structured within real estate investment trusts. They may well be structured within another form of wrapper, onshore or offshore, quite frankly. Not a lot the government can do to control that too specifically. So it's possible they could put it in limited companies, but they haven't done over the course of 10 years. I think pushing people towards the company route is what they wanted, because companies are much, much easier to enforce their compliance, to collect the right level of taxation from, and all the rest of it. And how much undeclared income there was in the private rental sector, I've never seen any particularly reliable numbers that aren't guesswork. But again, we probably, listening to this video, if you know 1,000 people plus, you probably know one or two who've had undeclared buy-to-let income over the years. Whenever I've come across people, and they have generally confessed to me as a safe voice, I've said to them, listen, put your hands up. It's much easier and there's been amnesties and things over the years. Put your hands up and don't get caught down the line, because 10 years plus worth of penalties could really finish you off. It's not the tax that you owe. You'll probably find, because you don't make huge money in terms of cash flow out of residential property, you haven't got a particularly big tax bill anyway, right? But fess up now rather than get caught. And if you do know anyone like that, that's probably the best advice to give them, I think. So, interesting enough, what could you then do right after Section 24 was announced? Well, you had a few choices. One of them was that you could pursue a route which included using Section 162 incorporation relief. And what this basically says, as a lord, bearing in mind, not a tax expert or anything like that, but what it basically says is, if you've got an endeavour that you've always run as a business, and we'll set aside Keir Starmer's comments around landlording and businesses for the moment, if it's always run as a business enterprise, but you've done it as a sole trader, then you can move that operation into a limited company structure with a few bonuses, if you like. Or at least a few concessions. So one of those would be stamp duty, land tax would not be due. So of course, what changed since Section 24 is that then 3% additional stamp was placed on any transaction, which was anything into a limited company or anything that wasn't a genuine first-time buyer transaction, if it was over £40,000 or over. Right, so that came into play, and that meant if you moved things, you'd have the stamp duty to consider, which was one factor aside from anything else. Of course, that 3% as I speak today is now 5%, and it's probably on the up, if anything, rather than on the down. Let's face it. So you could use this Section 162 incorporation relief. Now, one of the interesting things about Section 162 is that a whole number of landlords had already used Section 162 before Section 24. So why had they done that? Well, because apart from anything else, interesting enough, early on, 2012, I started using limited companies. I still do have properties in my personal name, but I started using limited companies myself. I was told at the time it was stupid by a mortgage broker who had profiled, probably should have stayed in her lane and stuck to mortgage brokering rather than tax structuring advice. But you see that all the time for professional services, and generally speaking, they're trying to help. But really helping you, they should be putting you towards someone who really knows what they're talking about. So that's what you had people using Section 162 already. Why? Because they were running big portfolios. This was going to help them in a number of different ways. There's a number of reasons to use the limited company. Succession planning, right? Future generations, aside from anything else, is one. Insurance and ring fencing assets. This is what limited companies are all about. Do you want to go bust if you have a freak public liability claim within a property? Right? Not necessarily. So you might well use a limited company in order to ring fence those assets other than anything else. So lots and lots of different reasons to use limited companies. At the time, one of the conventional pieces of wisdom on the circuit was buy the property in your personal name because the mortgages were a lot cheaper, but put the beneficial interest into a limited company. And this is where it starts to get slightly complicated. This concept of the beneficial interest has been around for at least 1,000 years. So what would happen 1,000 years ago is people might go to war and they would nominate someone to look after their assets for them. Quite often they would use what's called a bear trust, the most simple trust you could imagine. In those days it probably would have been written on something with a quill pen and had a wax seal on it in order to show that it was evidentially real apart from anything else. But they would look after your assets, your brother, your cousin, your uncle, your whatever, because if something happened to you in war, you would keep those assets alive for the benefit of the family. So the beneficial interest was recommended to go into the limited company, right? And the limited company would therefore declare the asset on its balance sheet. It would declare the profit and loss, the rent in, the mortgage out, etc., etc. And you were effectively, as the individual, the mortgage host for that, if that's the structure that you wanted to use. Not ideal. And of course, what happened when Section 24 happened is that lots and lots of mortgage terms and conditions changed. And some lenders were okay with it and some lenders weren't. And most lenders didn't really know and look too hard about what was going on. And no lender is going to look through every single set of limited company accounts in the UK to establish whether that property is on a balance sheet of a company somewhere. It would be impossible at the moment, even with AI being where it is, as far as I understand it, to perform that task anyway. So what they really concentrated on is once the mortgage was out there, were they getting paid in reality? And that's certainly been my experience in working in lenders. They're looking at mortgage debt and it being serviced other than anything else. So this is relevant because what happened is one of the solutions that was proposed was moving the beneficial interest, right, and keeping the legal the mortgages in personal names, but moving the beneficial interest into a company and using Section 162. So this is where it starts to get very complex. And in reality, my base level understanding of this is, and this is what happens in these situations quite a lot, it also happens in pharmaceuticals, it happens in lots of things. A, B and C are all approved individually by, in this case, HMRC, or in another case, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. But that doesn't mean that A and B can work or A, B and C can work because it's never really been tried before. And this is how the lawyers, the accountants and all that, but specifically the lawyers, make their money in these departments, because there'll be test cases. HMRC will take people to court and say, just because A and B doesn't mean A and B together. And HMRC have usually got an argument other than anything else. Then there was a second structure that was proposed, and that involved the use of a partnership. So in the run-up to Section 162, the conventional wisdom, the tax law, the precedent cases suggest that some form of partnership, possibly running for at least 3 years, would be needed before moving into the limited company structure in order to make sure everything was tickety-boo, if you like. But what they suggested you could do is use this LLP, which is a limited liability partnership, to control a certain amount, which happened to be the income that you wanted to take, and then the rest of the money would just go into the limited company. Now that's a vast oversimplification of the complexity of what was being sold, but that's effectively what it said. And as soon as you decide that you can choose relatively arbitrarily, without a very good case behind it, that some can go to an LLP and some can go to a limited company and it's all going to be fine, that smells completely wrong to me. It always did. I know two things to be true about HMRC. Number one, they look at intent. So what did you mean to do? And sometimes you change your mind. You might buy a rental property. You might think you're going to keep it forever. The tax might change, like Section 24, and you might then decide to sell it, right? Perfectly legitimate, in as much as you would be liable for capital gains tax on that if that asset was in your personal name, because your intent in the first place was to buy it to hold as an investment. Then your intent changed, the facts changed, you change your mind, that's allowed, right? So then you would pay CGT. If you bought it with the purposes of selling it, flipped it, if you will, like that, and you've done that in your personal name, that would count as income. That would count as a trade, right? Now, there aren't any hard and fast rules about how that's established, if you like, but generally speaking, that is the logic that gets used. So that's number one. And number two is what's called the duck test. So if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, etc., etc., it's a duck, right? And in this case, with the LLP and the limited company and the relatively arbitrary allocation of funds throughout that structure, it doesn't look legitimate. It fails the duck test, and that's why there was always going to be trouble. And sure enough, there is now a Spotlight 63 inquiry that is focusing on actually both of those schemes, aside from anything else. Lots of people being written to, lots of people concerned they might have to pay the stamp and back taxes and all the rest of it. Very, very difficult, very, very distressing for them. And then the problem that happens in the wider industry is the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. So I'm a fan of small business. I love small businesses, and one of the things I love about them most is they're agile. So anyone who's seen a tax change in 2015 and is still not incorporated in 2025 cannot be described as agile, aside from anything else. But property moves very slowly. Property is a slow-moving asset. There are people who've made lots of money from property by making it into a fast-moving asset, like property traders, for example. They take the slow and make it fast. It's very, very clever, apart from anything else. But generally, it's a slow-moving asset. So landlords move slowly. They feel they're steering a battleship, particularly when they've got a portfolio, because let's bear in mind, if you're even going to consider Section 162 incorporation relief, the relevant tax case is HMRC versus Ramsey. And in Ramsey, a lady with a block of 10 flats, individual self-contained units, had 10 units and was spending more than 20 hours a week of her time. So you often hear that test applied, 10 units, 20 hours a week of time. I dare say if you had 6 units but spent 40 hours a week of time because they were, for example, HMOs, let's say, then you may well be able to make the Section 162 argument. But the problem is the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater here. And because of the beneficial interest solution being under the spotlight, and because of the LLP/limited company hybrid solution, as it's known, being under the spotlight, everyone goes, oh my goodness, I knew it was the right thing not to incorporate all along. There we go. But look at what's happened in the interim. The tax kicked in, but the tax kicked in at extremely low interest rates. So it was all phased in by the 2019, 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19 and 19, 20. So by March, 31st of March 2020, or 5th of April technically, it was all phased in, 100% of the tax, right? But it wasn't very much because interest rates were very, very low still. It was only really when we came to December 21 and we went through that hiking cycle that we went through into August, September 2023, that we saw a massive increase in the incidence of Section 24. And what that meant was when base hit 5.25, if you're on base plus margin, you're paying 7.25. Almost certainly you would not be yielding 7.25% before considering finance costs, but after considering any management time, any maintenance, compliance, insurance, all the other things that you need to consider, voids, arrears, all the rest of it. When you're running a rental property, there will be very, very few landlords yielding at 7.25%. Now, it doesn't have to be 7.25 because you're not at 100% gearing. But what I've seen over the years is the traditional problem has been a lot of landlords had a big let off in March 2009 when the base rate dropped to 0.5%. And then what they did is, instead of thinking about how they might structure this as a business going forward, they did what most people would do, especially if they're not massively financially savvy or looking at it as a business, which many people didn't for many years. They took the money and they spent it. They had their money, which wasn't perhaps huge for the asset base that they had, but they took their money and they spent it. They didn't save it. They didn't put it into this. They didn't put it into that. They spent it and they got used to spending it. And so it was a huge culture shock for landlords when the base rate started rising like it did. And then you had people with some really quite big portfolios, had people coming to me with 40, 50, 100 properties saying, well, I'm not making any money anymore. So what's the point? And then that gives them another problem because selling portfolios is not an easy thing to do. Certainly not a full market value anyway. The more you give away, the easier it is to sell them, of course, naturally. But many people aren't willing to do that. And then they were also facing a big capital gains tax bill. Now, if you'd had people who'd either had properties in areas where they hadn't really moved up in value and had taken out 85% or even 100% mortgages back when they could in 2007, there wasn't even a lot of equity. If you had people who continually refinanced and refinanced and refinanced, they weren't necessarily on the super low rates, but they were still paying 3% on their mortgages or whatever. However, if they sold, they end up in this world where they owe 75% of the value of the property, and the other 25% there or thereabouts is going to be completely swallowed in CGT. So they'd already had their money. And if they'd refinanced and spent that money, which wasn't even income in the first place, they had a big problem. And honestly, their best way in some of those situations is to hand back the keys, because even at the point where, now that is obviously the end of any property owning career from there on in, because repossession, insolvency, etc., is not. So it's actually easier to walk away from a personal bankruptcy than it is from an insolvency in a company, as far as the lenders are concerned. But of course, it still hurts your credit. But there are people who will lend to people with impaired credit, but the rates that you pay are significantly costly, aside from anything else. And at the moment, in an interest rate environment where it's 6%, you're not going to find people that are going to lend to you particularly easily. So that's all the backdrop to what's happened in Section 24. I've been criticised many times over the past 10 years because I did have property in my personal name, as I said, I bought before and including 2012, and then moved over to the limited company. So people say to me, well, you weren't affected. I had plenty of property that was in my personal name, actually, plenty more than the average landlord. So I did pay the Section 24 tax. And what actually I've done over those years is I've moved the occasional one per tax year back in the days when we had. So I took action, you see. When there was a capital gains tax allowance, I moved them over to a limited company of mine. I paid 3% additional stamp duty, but I'm looking at an asset with another 20 plus years on the balance sheet of my company, hopefully generating some revenue, almost certainly generating some capital growth value. And I made the decision to pay that frictional cost, paid the CGT on any uplift that I had minus my allowance. These options, these doors are now closed, and this is why you have to take advantage of tax landscapes when they're there, because these things don't roll over. When back in the time when, especially if you had one with your partner and you could have £12,000 worth of allowance tax free, it was much easier. Of course, on some of those I paid 28% CGT, and now it's 24%. So actually, it might wash out to be the same aside from anything else. But that's what I'd done with my properties, and just got on with, and as you do in these situations, really got on with the new landscape, didn't worry too much about the old landscape, did something about it. I think in the defence of the landlords who haven't done anything, and the people that I know, and I know some really good people, great people, who have still got portfolios that are in their personal names, and they pay the tax, and they grumble and mumble about the tax a lot, but they pay the tax, and it's a lot of tax. It's hard for them, because me personally, my father was a tax and trust advisor, so I was lucky in that way that I had some of that in the family. I spent a lot of time and effort myself reading tax manuals, looking for the right people, reading some of the books. If you're interested, the most accessible books that I see are the Tax Cafe books series by Carl Bailey. I'd highly recommend them if you're into learning yourself and all the rest of it. I prefer to learn and understand, so I turn myself into a reasonably difficult client for the professional services that I work with, because I'm always asking them, what about this, what about that, can we do this, can we do that? And it makes them think, and sometimes they have to say, I need to go away and ask about that. And if you don't have that professional services person, instead you have the person who always tries to give you the answer, because you have one accountant, and that one accountant you trust. And I see this all the time for people who've got millions of pounds worth of property. One accountant, which is a high street shop somewhere in their local town or something like that, and it's a bit of a disaster, to be honest, because that person is an accountant. They are not a specialist tax advisor. If they are not at least a CTA or equivalent qualification chartered tax advisor, then be very, very cautious about taking tax advice from them. You shouldn't be taking tax advice from me. You shouldn't be taking tax advice from them. They should be preparing and submitting your limited company accounts. But the problem that you have at the very small level, at the micro level, is that you can't afford the big and best people and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. But I don't think you can delegate responsibility about that either. And I'm just going to close this video by talking about a post that I caused an awful lot of consternation on by, apart from anything else, the name of one of the companies, one of the hybrid solution, apart from anything else, to me, always sounded like Acme Pay Less Tax Limited or whatever. And I just think, if you don't understand that when you submit your accounts to HMRC, if they ever get looked at and they see that your accountant has got a name like Magical Accountants Taxation Disappearing or whatever, what do you think any human being is going to think when they see those accounts, right? They're going to think they're worth looking into, aren't they? They're going to think they're worth looking into. And what's happened in this whole landscape is the people who are the biggest and best and most professional and most aggressive salespeople, who at points in time have been paying thousands of pounds worth of commission for people who could put clients in front of them, have sold the most solutions. Those have not necessarily been the best solutions, which is pretty much always what happens. You'll know you can have the best product in the world. They still say that Betamax was better than VHS, but VHS were better at sales. I don't know about the technicals of that argument, but I do know it could be highly possible, because if you can't sales and market a product, you don't have a business. You certainly have a business at scale. So you've always got to bear that in mind. But I think if you had just applied the duck tests, right, HMRC's rules of intent, aside from anything else, if you'd applied that old, if it seems too good to be true, it usually is, and all the rest of it, you wouldn't have got tied up in all of those things. And that might sound a bit harsh, but I do strongly believe that. It's difficult. You need to go out and seek the very, very best advice that you can. You need to take as much counsel as you can. It's a huge undertaking, and it's still an undertaking that some landlords need to do. So go and find an interview, treat it like you're going into business with them, right? Treating it like you're getting married to them, right? Significant amount of due diligence aside from anything else. And that's what's needed to get you through these problems. I'd be interested to hear any comments from people that are sensible about Section 24 and about any more videos you might want me to do like this one. It's unlikely I'll have much time to do any in the next 6 weeks or so, but in future, very happy to take suggestions for these longer form sorts of conversations, or monologues as they turn out to be. Unfortunately, didn't get any sensible comments today, but hopefully in the future I will do. And if you don't already like and subscribe to the channel, that would be a big help to me, and I would really appreciate it. So I always close by saying the same thing: keep calm and carry on, folks. Thanks for listening.